We're living our truth now. Krista, what?
Krista who?
Twisted Delphian?
Did you say Christian Dolphin? So are you from Philadelphia?
Welcome to the Life After Leaving Podcast, an ex-Christadelphian podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Zinnia. Today's guest is Brian. Welcome back, Brian.
Thanks for having me back. I'm real excited to keep talking about stuff.
Wonderful. So as some of you may remember, Brian was previously on the podcast in episode 15, where he shared his story of growing up in the Church of God of the Abrahamic Faith / the Christadelphians. And at the end of the episode, Brian mentioned that since leaving the group, he has become a religious trauma therapist. So I've invited him back on the show to dive deeper into the topic of religious trauma. So I'm excited to hear more about it. And hopefully we can share some useful information and tips for our community of ex-Christadelphians. So Brian, you ready to get into it?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So let's talk about your professional background real quick for anyone who didn't listen to the previous episode. So what are some of your professional qualifications in this field?
Yeah, so I have a Master of Education in Clinical Mental Health Counseling. Sometimes people ask, why is it a Master of Education? That's just the school that it was in for some reason.
Okay.
I don't know. It's a real counseling degree, just to be clear. So I got that from Lamar University back in 2018, and that was a year after doing a year of practicum and internship. So I had another year of field experience on top of that. Mm-hmm. So I've been working with clients for coming up on 8 years now, which is pretty crazy. I don't know where the time went.
Yeah, congrats.
Thank you. I am a licensed mental health counselor in the states of Washington and Texas. And I have a private practice where I just work by myself, work with individual adults, and religious trauma is, it's my jam. It's what I really like working on with people.
Great. I'm glad to hear that you found that great fit for you and that you're excited to chat about it. And for this episode, should we probably give a qualifier that this is only for informational purposes?
Thank you very much for saying that. I was going to say it and I almost forgot. So thank you. Yes, this is not therapy.
Yes, this is not professional therapy. That should be one-on-one, and you should find a qualified practitioner. But we can still talk about religious trauma. So I think the best place to start is just, what is it? Let's get some definitions. So I figure let's start with, what is religious trauma? Yeah.
So I'll start off by saying, for one thing, even the concept of religious trauma clinically is pretty new. Mm-hmm. There was a term that was coined back in 2011 by an American psychologist named Marlene Winnell. I wrote some notes down before we started.
We are so much more prepared than last time.
Religious trauma syndrome is not a clinical or diagnostic term. It was just something that she came up with.
That was the early term?
Yeah. And as a syndrome, that means the collection of symptoms.
Okay.
Like weak critical thinking skills, difficulty in making decisions, decreased sense of self-worth, difficulty building strong relationships, being unfamiliar with mainstream culture or isolation, or struggling with fitting in and belonging, kind of like feeling like a fish out of water, nightmares, sleeping issues, eating issues, sexual dysfunction, anxiety, sense of grief, guilt and fear, and loneliness. So that was a whole lot just right there. Those are the types of symptoms. And so it's defining it that way through just like what the symptoms are.
Yeah, it's based on the symptoms in order to get the diagnosis, basically.
Yeah. And it's still not a clinical diagnosis, so I couldn't put that in someone's notes and bill that to insurance. Yeah. But it's still kind of a working term because it's just something that someone came up with. More recently, in the last few years, a nonprofit organization was formed called the Religious Trauma Institute. Ooh. And they've been gradually doing research and trying to compile resources.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and they've come up with a couple of terms. And so for the definition they've come up with for religious trauma is the physical, emotional, or psychological response to religious beliefs, practices, or structures that is experienced by an individual as overwhelming and disruptive, and has lasting adverse effects on a person's physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being.
Mm-hmm.
I like that definition. I think it's broad and it covers a lot of different points.
Mm-hmm,
and I think different folks with their experiences are going to resonate with like particular words in there. So basically, with those kind of more formal definitions, even though they're working, it's essentially, trauma that happens in a religious environment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad that people are starting to talk about it more. It is not something that gets talked about enough.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I could say is I could just talk about what trauma is, first of all, as well. Because I think that'll be really helpful.
For starting.
Yeah, and this honestly might be the most important point that we make in this entire conversation. And I'm just going to put it out here front.
Yeah.
A lot of times people think of trauma as referring to the events that we experience.
Mm-hmm.
And technically, you can use that. You can use the word trauma colloquially in whatever way works best for you. But if you're being clinical, when we use the word trauma, we are really referring to the nervous system response that your body has to a threat. What that means is that you might have two people. We often use the example of like two twins, two siblings that had the exact same upbringing at the exact same time. For some reason, they experience the exact same scary event, and one of them walks away and it just doesn't bother them. Their nervous system does not store any like big long-term physical memory. It does not change their behavior or their feelings, really. They just walk away from it. And the other twin walks away and they're shaken up, and it changes the way they feel. It changes their behavior because their nervous system has developed a response to that type of stimulus.
And now they're having the symptoms potentially from that list that you had shared. Like they're having the nightmares and they're having all these stress responses, and the other one's okay. So trauma, it's not necessarily that incident. It's more the response to the incident.
Right.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Because again, trauma then is also subjective. It sounds like, because then it could be that I am traumatized by something and someone else isn't, which again becomes interesting, especially when talking about ex-Christadelphians specifically, is we could have grown up in the same exact ecclesia, in the same family system, and I could have been traumatized by something that happened in that, and someone else might not have been, by the same incidents that were happening. So this is a very personal thing, and people should, I guess, be open and just accepting that I may be dealing with these things that happen differently than other people, and that's okay too.
Exactly right. And I think that's what makes this such an important point, especially for religious trauma, because I think that's one particular type of trauma that tends to get downplayed, either by other people. A lot of times the trauma is you try to speak up for something that doesn't seem right. It gets shut down. That in itself could be traumatizing, but you also might downplay it to yourself after that.
And depending on the system, it could be like, oh, well, now you're the black sheep.
Right. Another piece of this is going back to the idea of clinical diagnosis. At least in the United States, we do not currently have a diagnosis for what is called complex trauma or complex PTSD.
I have heard that. Yeah, I read some books on complex PTSD, and they're like, this is something that exists in the way that people speak about it. But if you look, it's not like in the DSM, which is like the official book that tells you all the diagnoses that are out there.
I recently heard,
I guess.
Yes. I recently heard, and I have yet to confirm this, so take this with a grain of salt. Feel free to Google it afterwards. I think in other countries it has become a diagnosis code.
Okay.
And a lot of people are expecting complex PTSD in the next American diagnostic manual to be there.
I would think so. I think it's probably about time, honestly.
Oh, it certainly is. But just to point this out, that the difference between PTSD as it is in our manual right now, that refers to witnessing a violent act or a near-death experience. It's honestly pretty limited in terms of the type of event that needs to create the symptoms.
Yeah.
Whereas complex trauma or complex PTSD is more often about relationships. It's about growing up in a complicated environment
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's almost like I wish I had a more trauma-informed term here or phrase, but it's kind of like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah, I could see that, though. It's more the silent, invisible kind of things. And
Yeah.
even one of the concepts I'm familiar with is what they call ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. And I remember learning about that when I kind of got into reading self-help books as I was leaving the group and on my own, trying to figure out why I felt so broken and damaged inside. And it was interesting to go through the list. And even though I grew up in, a stable environment in the sense of having, two parents that were married my whole childhood, we always had food on the table. Like, I was taken care of. I was in this stable community, even with like the Christadelphians. I was there every week. Everyone knew who I was. You would think that is like an idyllic upbringing. But for me, there was so much invisible trauma, that I discussed in my episodes. So I don't need to get into that here. But where I grew up with a lot of issues and just invisible traumas for sure. So I can definitely relate to that. And then seeing the ACEs, it was things like, did you have an adult that was trusted that wasn't a parent that you could go to? And I was like, no, because like you couldn't go to people within the Christadelphians between like the gossip and everyone being pretty much exactly the same because you all believe the same things. And I forget what they all were now, but I remember seeing that and seeing that a number of those were relevant. And they weren't things I would have named myself and been able to like put my finger on and be like, oh, well, that's why I had issues, in my childhood, where my childhood wasn't as nice as it may have looked from the outside. So I think that was really informative when people are actually able to identify those things. That was another thing that was helpful for me, and maybe we can link to in this episode for people to look into.
I think that'd be a great idea. And I'm actually glad that you brought up the ACEs, because another concept, another term that the Religious Trauma Institute developed is the adverse religious experience.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Yeah, it's new. And I believe maybe they have a tool that's not public facing yet. But
share.
At the very least, the definition for adverse religious experience. And so this is going to be different than the definition for religious trauma that they came up with. Mm-hmm. An adverse religious experience is any experience of a religious belief, practice, or structure that undermines an individual's sense of safety or autonomy and or negatively impacts their physical, social, emotional, relational, or psychological well-being. So the how that's different from religious trauma is they started with any experience of a religious belief, et cetera, et cetera. And whereas religious trauma is the physical, emotional, or psychological response to religious beliefs, et cetera, et cetera.
And it's still very broad, though, which is good, I imagine.
Yes. And this is still, I think, a helpful concept, because what it means is you may have also, we gave the example of the twins. Let's say the other twin that walked away and was fine. That twin might be able to look back and say, no, I wasn't traumatized, but it was an adverse religious experience. I don't have a nervous system response that developed from that.
Okay.
But I know that, fill in the blank.
Mentally or emotionally, there was something wrong, something not ideal, perhaps.
I know that what that adult was saying was messed up. Or I can see how that would create a trauma response in someone else, even if that didn't do that to me.
Well, it could even like break your trust and have other things like that are negative. It's more just saying like, I don't get heart palpitations thinking about it. Like I'm not having a physical response. Okay.
Right. Do we also want to talk about what we mean by nervous system responses real quick?
If you want to dive into it, whatever you think gives people a good foundation for this episode so that we're not leaving anyone behind who's not familiar with this stuff. Because I know I read these kinds of books, so it's a little more familiar to me. You're the professional, so let's get into it then. Okay.
We're going to talk about a number of different types of situations that can create trauma or at least adverse experiences. And so the framing, as we're talking about this or as people are listening to it at home, the framing I want to offer is, what do we mean by a nervous system response? And by that, we're talking about fight or flight, which is a term that a lot of people have heard, but maybe not everybody. A fight response is a response you have to a threat. And since you and I are both dog people, I'm going to use dogs as
Go for it, yeah.
A dog is on a walk. The dog sees another dog and it doesn't like it, and it starts barking. It's aggressive. That's the fight response. Or the dog sees the other dog and it gets scared. Yeah. And so maybe it yelps and it puts its tail between its leg and it runs away. That's a flight response. But there are two other responses that we don't always hear about, but they are also very important, especially in these ones. Contexts.
Freeze.
There's also freezing, exactly. So a dog might see another dog, and it might get low to the ground, and it might just stay there. The other dog comes by and sniffs. It might just like stay frozen and let the other dog do whatever. Maybe the other person comes by and but it just like stays still.
Yeah. That's
the freeze response.
And fawn.
And the fourth one is fawn, exactly.
Got it.
Yes. 4 for 4. You did it. You've been reading the books. Like you said. Fawning is when the dog rolls over onto its back and shows its belly and says, "Hey, pet me. I'm safe. I'm showing you that I'm not threatening. You're threatening in my mind, but I'm not threatening to you."
So maybe you'll leave me alone. Like when they say to like pretend to be dead when you see a bear.
Yes.
I was like, don't attack me.
Yeah. So these are very like mammalian nervous system responses that we have. And especially for many of us when we're still trapped in the religious context, a lot of times we are freezing and fawning. Very frequently. I still find that when I go home and I see extended family, for example, or I just happen to see church people, whatever the situation, I fawn all the time. I turn on my charisma and I'm joking a whole lot, but I'm like bobbing and weaving in the conversation. I'm not really letting anyone like pin me down and actually talk to me about anything real because that's my trauma response, or one of my trauma responses to those ambush conversations we talked about last time. Right? So I just want to point that out. If you're trying to figure out, is this a trauma response? And this is what helped me realize, I have some of this trauma.
Because if you're having these reactions.
Yeah, right.
Then that's a sign.
And again, like if it's not trauma, you might still feel weird about something. You know,
logically, but not in your body necessarily.
Even if it is in your body, it might not be one of those 4 responses.
Okay.
So, like, for example, this is how I'm going to differentiate from trauma. I also mentioned last time the first time I went to a Christadelphian rather than a Kogath Bible school, I saw that all the other kids were referring to all the adults as aunt and uncle. And I knew, and not only did I know, I was able to formulate the words to myself. This is weird, but it felt icky, but I didn't have any of those responses. And one of the reasons why is because it wasn't enforced. No one told me that I had to do that.
That makes sense.
I saw it and I was like, I'm just not going to do it. And it was fine. It was totally fine that I didn't.
Okay, so how it was handled with that situation made the difference.
Yeah.
It sounds like you had a little more autonomy too, though, which probably is part of it, I imagine.
Absolutely.
Because you were allowed to say, no, I'm not going to do that. And if you can't say no, then I feel like you're more likely to use one of those other responses where it's like you're either going to fight with someone, which will, embarrass you and escalate the issue potentially. So then you kind of have to fall to the other ones that are less likely to make an issue in this, closed environment that has a high, social code that everyone kind of has to follow.
Absolutely. So yeah, so I just wanted to point that out, that you might feel weird, but that might not be trauma. So going to those 4 Fs, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, those are really helpful indicators to figure out, is my body absorbing something? And am I using those responses to similar stimuli in other situations?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. That's where we get trust issues and relationship issues and nightmares, even when you're not in a church environment, right? It's your body is still experiencing that.
Yeah, still reacting to it, even though the acute threat may not be there anymore. Okay. Well, I think that was a great intro to all of this. So we have some good basis here. And are there any other important concepts that we should know about when discussing religious trauma and its development? Did you want to talk about attachment theory or anything like that as well?
There are some other things that are more specific to what people experience and when they leave and so on, things like deconstruction and deconversion and what recovery might look like. I think the one other thing I want to point out right now is that there's also a difference between trauma and abuse.
I feel like there would probably be overlap, though, I would think.
Oh, sure. There is overlap, yes. But I say that in the sense that abuse does not have to be present for trauma to occur.
Okay.
So I was describing experiences that I had in my last episode.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think any of the people I talked about were abusive.
Mm-hmm.
I think I wish they had done things differently, but they were not abusing me. And I still created some level of a nervous system response.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to use one other term here, or a couple terms that people use. These are more like pop psychology terms or things that people just use with their therapists just to guide the conversation. Sometimes people use the terms uppercase T or big T trauma.
Okay, I have heard that. And the little t trauma.
Yeah, or little t or lowercase t trauma. And they are not objective definitions for those terms.
No, but I imagine it helps people feel a little bit more validated that basically wherever your trauma was on the spectrum, it's valid and it's okay for it not to be the worst thing imaginable. And I think often people who have traumatic experiences, myself when I was an adolescent, I remember this, feeling like, oh, people have it so much worse, just get over it. And I just really couldn't, having been sexually assaulted at a young age, it was very traumatic for me. And it was, even though it's like, oh, people are starving and there's that self-gaslighting that can definitely happen. So I think that can be a good thing for people, even if they can't admit, yes, this was a traumatic experience, to at least say, oh, it's a lower T trauma, but it's still valid. So if that's the way that they think about it to get them to accept it, then I feel like that's okay. That's a good first step.
That's pretty much the whole point I've been trying to make this whole time, right? It's if you have had harmful experiences, those experiences are valid. If you have been hurt, then that is important. And it's something to pay attention to. I think that we all need to be able to hear that, whether it's trauma technically or not.
Yeah, I think that's a good one too. And I wouldn't have even thought about that. And then one other term that you had mentioned that we should probably cover is just what does it mean to be triggered?
Yeah. I wanted to bring that up just because that's a term that's been going around a lot these last several years.
Yeah.
And I also think it's been misunderstood in some contexts, generally misunderstood by people making fun of other people who don't want to be triggered.
Yeah, some people really don't have empathy, and that's one subject that really brings it out.
Oh, man. That in itself is triggering. And I just wanted to point that out, that when I think a lot of people, especially when they recognize their triggers, and some people are going to recognize their triggers just because they watched a helpful TikTok video. But I think a lot of people are going to develop an awareness of their triggers through therapy, right? And they're going to develop an awareness of these are the types of situations, these are the types of stimuli that create or summon these nervous system responses. I know the types of things that are going to make me really upset. I know the types of things that are going to make me fight or flight, freeze or fawn.
Yeah, I remember every time rape came up, I used to freeze, and I had a really serious response to it. And at that point, I hadn't done any therapy, anything around it. And until I started addressing it, I was very triggered whenever it came up or I saw it somewhere, and it's in social media, it's on videos and movies and stuff. So it was definitely something that fortunately now isn't, but that's part of why I try to do little trigger warnings at the beginning of episodes where we talk about some heavy things, just because I know what that feels like and it sucks. Just to be very honest about it. And it's not something that means that you're weak, and it's not something that's necessarily bad, but it's something to acknowledge with yourself. And I think it's better to be aware of it so you can make informed decisions, because some people said, oh, I was aware that you put that trigger there and it helped me, but then I knew what was coming and I could make a decision if I was ready to listen to it or not. Because it doesn't mean like, oh, I'm weak, I'll never be able to listen to that. But it's maybe I'm not ready right now. Maybe today is not a good day for that because I'm already not in a good place with my nervous system today, and having something unexpected can really make the trigger worse. So that's why I put that out there. And I have no problem with trigger warnings because it really just seems like a way of being respectful to people who went through something bad and haven't been able to really get to a healthier place for their nervous system yet. And that's okay. Better to be aware of it. And hopefully someday it improves, but it's okay.
Yeah, sometimes we see this maybe in family members, for example, who they know that their loved one has experienced trauma, or they have a trigger, and they say, I know you have a trigger, but the only way to get through it is exposure. And they're like, you just got to push yourself. You just got to get over it. And that person might be ready to take on that stimulus again.
I feel like more likely they're just going to have more trauma and make it worse.
There's a very high chance of re-traumatizing someone by doing that. Yeah, exactly right.
Well, even just think about, like, it has nothing to do with being weak or strong. Like, think about vets that come back from war and fireworks set them off and they have PTSD episodes and they're, like, traumatized because of some trigger like that, or like a car backfiring kind of thing. And again, they went through something traumatic being in war where it's life and death potentially in a situation that had that stimulus. So it's no surprise that they would still have that reaction. And it's not like, oh, we should just send them to war again, they'll get better. Like, that's not, going back into that situation isn't necessarily going to fix it. So again, just seeing that logic play out, like, that doesn't make sense.
Right. And I think it's easier for the general public to accept that idea around uppercase T trauma, like war veterans. But it's the same thing for lowercase t trauma. If your nervous system doesn't feel safe, it may take time. It may take one step at a time before we can actually be in touch with the stimulus again.
Makes sense. So I had asked in the group if there was anyone who had questions about religious trauma or comments that they wanted to make. And we did have a number of people reach out to me privately. And it was interesting to see the things that came up when we started talking about this topic. So a lot of people mentioned unhealthy coping mechanisms. So when you think about, like, alcoholism, hypersexuality, abusive relationships that people got into where they kind of felt like they needed someone. And so they accepted the first person who came around, even if they weren't the nicest. And then also a lot of people mentioned having mental health issues. So, depression, anxiety, chronic fight or flight, where, at the slightest provocation, they're fighting or fleeing, whatever that may look like for them. So it was interesting to see so many ways that this had come out, and people were saying this is all tied to religious trauma for them. So these are some of, like, the things that can be an effect of it.
Yeah. Still keeping in mind the idea of these, 4 nervous system threat responses. You listed a number of different behaviors that people can engage in. And like the very first one, alcoholism, that may be a response to cope with the trauma response that they experience.
So these
for
then
example,
becoming secondary to the initial thing, basically?
Right.
Okay.
So, for example, and this might not be the way it works for everybody, and I'm not a substance abuse expert, but if drinking, for example, is a coping response, what that means is maybe they're using that to dissociate or lessen the trauma response that they would have. A lot of times when we have religious trauma, we end up with those really hurt feelings. The memories come up. We remember how powerless we felt. We may remember us freezing in a situation and wishing we had done something differently. This happens so often with religious trauma, and the memory is really painful because you remember still having a sense of powerlessness or still some regret or what have you, and still just having that sensation fill your body when the memory comes back. Someone might use drinking to dissociate from that memory. So
just, and potentially reduce the feelings too.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I feel good when I drink. I feel, something better than I felt then. For me, I remember feeling a lot of shame. And so it might be like, oh, well, I feel more confident when I'm drinking. And so it almost like replaces it temporarily, like one feeling with another.
Yeah. The same thing could happen with getting into certain types of relationships. Maybe just looking for some kind of sense of safety. Which honestly, even dissociating through drinking might be something that tries to help a person find a sense of safety. Not that I'm endorsing drinking.
Okay, please don't.
I'm not endorsing alcoholism.
Yes.
I'm also not endorsing getting into, abusive relationships.
I don't think you are. Don't worry.
Okay. But there may be something there where just with the raw memory by itself, with the raw physical memory still in someone's body that's been still unprocessed, that feeling is so unsafe. They're going to engage in behaviors that maybe can help them find a sense of safety.
Yeah, it may be in a more temporary way or a more impulsive way, but in a way that they feel is attainable and alleviates the discomfort that they're going through.
Yeah. You asked if I had something to say about attachment earlier. Here's something that I will say about attachment. This is something that I've heard other clinicians talk about is someone with a disorganized attachment style where they really have trouble knowing what to expect out of their relationships because they previously had relationships with parents or family or authority figures early on, for example. If those relationships created just a general sense of danger in relationships, a person might still gravitate to that same type of relationship because that at least they have the most experience with.
Mm-hmm.
It might be unpredictable, but the unpredictability may be predictable in a way, if that makes sense. So they're still trying to find a sense of safety there. Sometimes, and I was listening to a podcast episode about this recently too, about how sometimes people, they know that somewhere in their system, they know that they are not in a healthy relationship. And their nervous system is still trying to figure it out, still trying to work through the memories by saying, I'm going to be in this situation, and this time around, I'm going to find a way to be safe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about my bad decisions. Don't mind me.
I'm not trying to call you out.
It's okay. So many people are like, just don't mention me. And I'm like, no problem. My life is ripe with examples. No, because I think even like having been in abusive relationships, like no part of me consciously was like, oh, this time I'm going to figure it out. Like there was no conscious part of it. But it was so interesting how I was so unprepared to deal with it because I had always accepted it and it was just so normal, and there was no like self-protection mechanisms for me where I was just like, oh yeah, of course people yell at me. I get yelled at home all the time. And just like it took being uncomfortable, making new relationships, getting new environments, and getting out of that comfort zone that made me start to see things and be like, what do I actually want? And where's my sense of self-worth to say I'm allowed to say what I want and to say no to what I don't want? And so for me, it was that whole part of it was having to get comfortable with not being in that environment and having to say I've had enough of that. But it's definitely not intentional. It got to, I think, just a breaking point for me where I was like, it was really not safe. And I don't want to be on the news. Like,
I'm glad that you weren't.
Yeah, then you wouldn't have this wonderful podcast.
That's not what I meant.
I know.
To kind of answer your original question here.
Yeah.
I think the guiding question that maybe you can ask is like, what's the danger? What is the danger or the threat that I am really trying to deal with or get away from?
I always feel like, what's the motivator? Like, why am I making these decisions?
Yeah.
And so it's
basically
kind
the
of
same
like,
thing.
Yeah, what are you feeling?
Yeah. So that may take time. Actually, I say that I'm a religious trauma therapist. I'm actually right now in the process of retooling my website and broadening what I'm advertising a little bit, because I've been realizing this over the last couple of years. Not everybody knows, oh, this is religious trauma. But they might know, I've got trust issues.
Yeah.
They might know, I feel a lot of shame. And maybe I don't know why yet. I get angry at people all the time. I have a lot of trouble setting boundaries. So just to point out that realizing that it's religious trauma sometimes isn't even the first step. Sometimes that's further down the road.
Well, that's what I was thinking, is like, how would you know if you have religious trauma? Because like, I didn't know, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily. I mean, I think the ones that are probably the most potent are people that feel like they have purity trauma, where, it's their wedding night and they still can't bring themselves to be intimate with their now husband or wife. because it was so internalized for so long when they were, like a minor, unmarried, that it's shameful, it's bad, God doesn't like it. He's watching you, in your bedroom with what you're doing. And like, they can't turn that programming off because it's such a strong reaction, and they had kind of trained themselves to have a reaction, shut it down, shut it down, shut it down, or feel shame, feel shame, feel shame, and then that continuing on. So that one I feel like people might recognize the most, and I feel like I've heard more about. But I think some of the other ones where you're just really reactive, where you're like really angry or defensive or scared or whatever it is that is how you're reacting with your nervous system. I think it's just my thoughts is that you may not know you have religious trauma until years later. It really could take time. I think it takes time to acknowledge anything that was negative potentially, depending on where you're at with things mentally and what your reason was for separation. Like for me, I just took a break and never went back. So during that break, I wasn't like, oh, these things are bad and these things are causing me trauma. No, that wasn't even on my mind. And I was still very much having those reactions. I was constantly in fight or flight, absolutely, during that time. And so it was only like once I got to a safe environment that I started being like, oh, so this is what safety feels like. And I think at that point, I could recognize that I had that fight or flight response. I could recognize who and what was triggering it. And at that point, I was like, oh, okay, so I am being pushed into these reactions by people bringing up religion and people treating me a certain way using religion as their justification for whatever they said or did. So yeah, that's a part of it. Potentially. And so it wasn't like as clear as you may think it would be when you just read it on paper. It can be something that you don't realize on any specific time frame.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece to this, the idea of just finding safety first and being able to feel the difference. Because you might not be able, I'm just going to call myself out on what I was saying earlier, the idea of being able to even tell that your nervous system is having these responses that might feel completely normal to you. You might not really be able to detect it.
You might never get out of that phase, really, where you spend all day, all night, you're like running around, stressed out, high stress, and not realize what it's like to be relaxed or to feel safe. You don't recognize what it would feel like. I think it's very easy to stay at that high level of nervous system activation. So that's why I think like some of the things like mindfulness and all can be helpful, because no matter where you are, you can try to bring your nervous system down to a calmer place. And then that brings you to that baseline where you can see when it goes up into that activated mode. Because you can even do that in your car and just be like, okay, after work, I'm going to do that before I go home. And then you walk inside, your heart rate spikes because someone's running at you with a Bible in hand. And you're like, then you realize like, okay, being home around someone that's very zealous is triggering. Okay. But yeah, I think having that separation definitely would help.
Yeah. And just to point it out too, even that might be really difficult for folks as well, depending on just how activated their nervous system always is.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to throw this out there that
I'm not saying it's easy.
For some folks, like therapy really might be the way for them to even detect what's going on inside of their bodies. And what you're also doing there, we talked about like surface behaviors and, angry outbursts and trust issues and so on. Mm-hmm. What we're talking about is basically being able to slow down enough to really be with that, to be with just that whole response that you have, that whole behavior, slowing down with it, to really see where it's coming from. So therapy might really be the way to go for some folks before they can really detect any of this stuff.
Yeah, it was shocking to me once I was able to start tuning into my own intuition, trusting myself, to see how eventually it became very easy to see when different things were upsetting to me and all this stuff. But I think part of the religious environment and culture, because that spreads into, I think, the domestic sphere as well, when both of your parents and all of the family members are also in the religious group, was that it was hard to see, because I feel like you kind of have to self-gaslight a lot, in my experience, where you don't have as much autonomy because your identity is supposed to be with the group. Your beliefs are supposed to match the group. And so anything you're feeling that doesn't really support the group and doesn't speak positively to it, you kind of have to squish down or feel shame around of like, oh, I haven't been praying enough. I haven't been reading my Bible enough. I'm not a good, Christadelphian. You kind of have to squish that down. And so I feel like there's a lot of that activation there, and there's a lot of denial of how you're feeling and not being able to express it and all of that as well. So I think some of that may play into it too. I know for sure I definitely had to cut off my intuition, wasn't listening to it. And so I kind of had to relearn that. And I remember, I think Katura and Heather and some other people had the same kind of experience where after leaving, part of the deconversion process, I guess, was just listening to your intuition again, listening to your gut, trusting yourself again, and letting yourself feel things. And if someone doesn't feel safe actually acting on it, instead of being like, oh, well, they're Christadelphians, so they must be safe. When it's like, that they're not. But you weren't allowed to say it, so you just had to like find a workaround and be like, okay, I feel really uncomfortable, but I have to sit here quietly and like fawn or freeze or whatever because I can't do anything about this.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into Christadelphian culture and honestly just even religious trauma in general, not specifically or exclusively Christadelphian culture.
Absolutely not exclusively, no. But I think having our audience targeted as being ex-Christadelphians, then we can use Christadelphian culture
for sure,
since that's relevant for them. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think that's one of the most difficult problems. That's one of the things that makes the trauma so complex. It's one of the reasons that we downplay things so much. Is there is a lot of self-gaslighting and telling yourself that you're doing fine when you're not. And when you've done that for 18 plus years, going back as far as you can remember, like how do you even tell?
Yeah, it's so normalized and it's like encouraged.
One of the first things for me that helped me start to like open up my feelings about religion, I didn't talk this last time, but when I started going to therapy in my late 20s, one of the things my therapist challenged me on was my conceptualization of selfishness.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I could see that.
Yeah, I was really worried about being selfish in the way I was managing my relationship stuff. And he was like, well, what makes it selfish? And it helped me realize, I guess I just feel icky about it.
Yeah.
And we spent a while going back into, church culture and family culture. And I had already left the church, but I started realizing it had been a few years. I don't think I'd ever had anyone have a conversation with me about like, if you put your needs first, that actually might be good for everybody involved.
Yeah.
Even if it can be painful along the way. I had never had anyone offer that to me.
Except on the airplane where they're like, put your oxygen mask on first and then help the others. That's really the only example that's like widely shared of like, take care of yourself first, then take care of others.
Yeah. So it didn't point me immediately to religious trauma. It was another several years before I was able to understand,
okay.
I have trauma responses.
Yeah.
But it was something that helped me at least move towards being able to have a better understanding of what church had done to me. And how
the impacts it still had.
How it had like molded these values that didn't really make sense in a worldview where you're not worried about going to the kingdom.
Yeah, but where it had served their purposes, where you would always put the church first, as opposed to your needs. And now in the real world, that wasn't what was serving you. Thank you for sharing. That's definitely insightful. And for anyone who didn't listen to your interview episode, I thought it was really interesting the bit you had shared about attachment and how with a group, it could be that they are both the danger and the safety. Would you mind just sharing that again for anyone who didn't listen to that other episode?
Yeah. And I want to cite Alexandra Stein, who I mentioned at the end of the episode last time as well. She wrote the book, Terror, Love, and Brainwashing: Attachment in Cults and Totalitarian Systems. She wrote that book. And I also, in response to a comment someone left for the last episode, I did find a nice, not particularly graphic 20-minute YouTube clip where she kind of summarizes this stuff as well. So we can link to that as well.
Yeah, great. Since we know we have some audio listeners, so they can listen to that.
But the basic idea is when a cult is really running on all cylinders, what it's doing is exactly what you just said. It is creating a threat, and it in itself is the threat. So, for example, if the church is saying, if you don't behave properly, we're going to disown you. You're going to lose community. You may be shunned by your own biological family. Mm-hmm. That is a threat that the group is presenting. If there is one particular leader or like a small group of leaders and they're presenting it, then they themselves are the threat if they're the ones that would carry out that type of discipline. But what cults also do is they make themselves the target of love. They say the only way to get away from the threat that we are presenting is to move closer to us. So if you go back to that idea of fight or flight, there's a threat and you may want to flee, but you can't do that. Because if you flee, that's the very thing that they're saying that you're not allowed to do, and then the threat will happen. So they say the only way is to fawn. The only way, or to freeze maybe.
Yeah.
The only way to get away from the threat that is us is to come closer to us. And it's extremely confusing. And it's how brainwashing occurs under extreme conditions. Because people are exhausted, their nervous system is fried. A lot of times when people get physical resources taken away from them, especially, they can't sleep, they don't get enough food, and so on. Or if the threat is just really bad, parents are separated from their children and they're told, we'll reunite you guys later. For example, the only thing that they can do is stay in the group and try to appease the group, try to appease the leader as much as possible, even if there's something in their nervous system telling them to do the exact opposite.
And I feel like that makes so much sense, and especially for why it's so hard for people to leave, because that was something else that has come up periodically. And again, when I mentioned that we were going to be doing this episode, is, even with this episode, people saying, I'm afraid to even have you discuss my name or my story with any tangible details. And you also have people who said, I couldn't leave the group and I knew I didn't believe it and I knew I didn't want to be there. And I kept going for years. And a lot of guests have already said they kept going for months. And a lot of them were acclimating other people to it or whatever. But for a lot of people, it was themselves not being ready. And so I feel like that dynamic too is part of just what keeps people there and makes it so hard to leave. And when you consider other healthy groups like a club, all you have to do is not show up. It's okay, I guess she's not coming anymore. That's fine. And there's no repercussion. But when you're in a high control group that places more demands on you, where they're going to notice if you don't stay for, the Sunday tea after the memorial service, and they're going to notice that you're not volunteering to do Sunday school anymore, or whatever it is, you start to have these repercussions. And no matter what, there's something, a lot of it's social, but it really does feel like a really big threat when that's such a big part of your world, because they do also make themselves a huge part of your world where you typically have less strong or less in just the number of people that you're connected with closely outside of the group. So that as well, where that becomes where you're so reliant on them. So all those factors too, I imagine, play a role in it.
Yeah, I think that's all correct. I think about with my story, the leverage that the church really had on me after I moved away, I moved across the country. There was not very much leverage that they had. And yet there was still, even just enough, even the social bits, if I ever move back to where I came from, I'm probably going to run into these people because of my parents. And I'm just going to have to keep dealing with either fawning and not really engaging or fighting.
Yeah.
And saying, okay, let's have it out. Let's have this big conversation. Doing that over and over and over with, 50 different people. That's the threat as my brain turned it into. It might not actually be that, but it's possible, right?
Yeah.
And so instead I fled. and I've stayed fleeing.
Honestly, that was kind of me too. It helps so much to move away. Just so much less threat, so much more safety, so much healing for me. And I know a lot of people have had similar experiences too. Is there anything else that sticks out to you about a typical Christadelphian environment that could increase the likelihood of someone developing religious trauma? Because I know we have a wide variety of more conservative to liberal groups, so just kind of the general.
Yeah.
And I have a few examples if you want me to read them off of things that people shared in the Ex-Christadelphian Facebook group.
Yeah, what if you went first?
Okay, so some of the things that have come up in the Ex-Christadelphian Facebook group that former members of the Christadelphians have mentioned that they kind of think of related to religious trauma that they experienced there. So one was children being encouraged to treat unsafe adults like family, like you're talking about calling people aunt and uncle that are strangers, but also just not having bodily autonomy. So like not being able to tell someone in the ecclesia that you don't want to hug or, something else in some way that they want to touch you. It's like, oh, they're part of the ecclesia. Of course they can have access to your body. Not necessarily sexual, but potentially getting into grooming and things like that. There's also being bullied by your peers in ecclesial environments, whether that's at camps or the regular, CYC youth groups or anything like that. Children being pressured to be baptized. So a lot of them feeling really intense peer pressure. So feeling expectations as well as some manipulation kind of feelings there. The fixation on purity, sex, marriage, and relationships. I think also when people try to break up relationships should be included in that. So the hypocrisy of the church covering up infidelity, abusive relationships, or child abuse is a big one. Isolation due to the shallow nature of relationships in the ecclesia and or not having close relationships with people outside of the ecclesia in their communities or families and things like that. So those are some of the ones that came up for things that could increase the likelihood of someone having religious trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with all of those things. They most certainly could create trauma. I can get into my list in a second that I came up with, and there's some overlap. But one thing that I want to point out, just from the things that you mentioned, I hear kind of two different categories that stand out to me. One being just individuals doing awful things.
Yeah.
So, doctrinally, Christadelphia does not endorse child abuse.
Yes.
Right. There may be like a spare the rod, spoil the child mentality, but they're not going to say, we should have pedophiles.
Yeah, and like child marriage and stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that is, people kind of doing their own thing. Maybe it's top down in a particular ecclesia, where it's coming from the top and they make it institutional in that ecclesia or a group of ecclesias. But it's not the doctrine itself. The trauma is coming from the behavior. But the other category that I hear, it kind of is, like it does come from doctrine.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting distinction. I think that's valid. But it's true because you've got the culture of ecclesias and you have like these micro ecclesias because there's no like one overarching head of it. So you could be in a more or less traumatizing ecclesia based on the people, how they're treating each other, what actions they're taking against each other. And so that's just part of it, is that they're all so unique. But I do feel like, yeah, the religion itself, there are things that will either lean itself to kind of inciting some of that too, where there's systems that are easier to be abused, where there are people that are, I think even women in general in those ecclesias are more likely to be kind of groomed into being victims when they're taught to be passive and not speak up and all that stuff. And always think about what the men are thinking when they look at you. Don't think about yourself and how you feel. So I think that's part of it. But I think the doctrine too. Which ones do you feel like were the most doctrinal?
Can I read my list?
Oh,
I
yeah.
think there's some overlap.
Okay, I'd love to hear your list.
And I think maybe my brain just goes to the doctrinal stuff more easily for some reason. But the place I started with was weirdly enough, waiting for the world to end.
Yeah,
and,
yeah. I always think about that one too.
The fear that can come from expecting the world to end in your lifetime.
At all times, 24/7. Yeah, it could come any second.
Yeah. Maybe you're afraid that you're not going to make it into the kingdom, or even if you're comfortable with the idea of getting into the kingdom, being afraid of seeing death and destruction all around you.
Or having your family left behind. There's that too.
But on top of that, even more immediately in the present, I've seen this doctrine often encourage people, and sometimes it's direct, like when they say, don't vote, don't go into the military. There's a fear of like getting involved. There's a fear of like going out into the world. Sometimes there's a fear of having really your life not revolve around the church because you're involved in these other efforts where you're trying to make the world a better place. That gets shut down. I know that I felt that growing up.
Yeah.
It took me well into my adulthood before I realized, maybe I said this last time, before I realized that there are like good lawyers out there.
Yeah. And I've experienced the same thing where I was like, oh, that's so nice. This lawyer's doing like pro bono work for like low income communities. Like, that's so nice.
And they can actually make people's lives better through legislation. Yeah. Who knew? So I think that I honestly think that trauma can come from just that doctrinal idea of, no, you should not get involved. Don't tell people that you're thinking about getting involved. Don't ask or try to find a way to justify it. Right. A fear of just all other religions, period.
Yeah.
Trauma coming from the culture of like getting called out. This is what you were saying. And also seeing like shifting standards over time where maybe you got in trouble for something, but someone a few months later did not, or there's just double standards.
Yeah, I believe that.
This family is more involved, and so people in this family that has deeper roots in the church are less likely to experience church consequences than this family that doesn't have as many relatives or is newer to the ecclesia. Just the general like us versus them mentality. Purity culture, just saying sex is bad. The doctrine's literally saying like, be afraid of sex until you get married. It's literally just be afraid. That's the messaging. Not having informed consent about being a part of the group, especially for kids.
Yeah, the fact that they're all almost always under 18. If they're not, they're like 19. They're like young. That feels very red flag to me. I really don't like that.
Yeah, well, and I mean, you mentioned how hard it can be to leave the church, like the church not offering any kind of exit plan.
No, you are not supposed to. That is the rule. There is no exit plan because you're not allowed to. You're not supposed to. And I think that's part of, again, why they try to like trap children, because they're like, well, you committed. It's a lifelong commitment. But they do it before you have like all of your critical thinking skills. They specifically target adolescents. And it's just incredible to see. I was like, oh, that's a smart plan, because you're really trying to like trick them into it when they're at an age where they want to please their parents and haven't really identified a strong sense of self. And then right when they're getting there, they're like, okay, let's trap you. And then we're going to say it's a lifelong commitment. You're now married to Jesus, basically, and you can't leave. And I'm like, what? I wasn't even 18. I can't even legally marry another human being. And you're saying I'm married to Jesus now? Like, what?
And if they are doing that on purpose, it is extremely conniving, because the whole reason that they don't do infant baptism is that they're claiming that baptism is consensual.
That is a good point. Yeah.
But it's like, why are we pressuring 14-year-olds to do this?
And I know for me personally, which is, the perspective I'm only able to speak from, is I remember it was after a weekend where they were pushing baptism. And it was a youth weekend event. It wasn't a mixed audience of adults and kids. It was all young people. And that was the intention. And it worked, from peer pressure, using fear as a motivating tactic. Because if you don't do this, you're going to get left behind when the world ends. You're not going to make it into the kingdom. I was like, this is all manipulation. So I feel like it's absolutely invalid if people are underage and you're manipulating them. Like, how is that ethical? It's just, like I said, major red flag for me.
Yeah. As a therapist, I'm ethically and legally mandated to have informed consent with my clients. I have to sign informed consent documents in which we say, this is how this is going to work. You're only committing to one appointment at a time. And if you ever want to leave, here are the things that I, as the provider, owe you, because there is a power dynamic here. Even with me trying to take a gentle, collaborative approach, there is a power dynamic here. You are paying me so that I can try to create this delicate space for you to be extremely vulnerable, not only with yourself, but technically also with me. So I have to, there has to be informed consent about what that looks
Absolutely.
like.
And there's a reason those laws exist.
Right. And I think this is something that churches could do, because the other part of informed consent is to say there are risks involved. You know, there are risks and there are no guarantees.
And that there's two sides of every story. So it's like, all right, before I get baptized, can I talk to someone who's left? Like, let me talk to a panel of ex-Christadelphians before I go into my baptismal interview with 3 baptized Christadelphians. Like, that feels more fair to me. All right, so we're going to show up to the baptismal exam and be like, all right, you can talk to us first, and then you go talk to them, see how you feel. We'll ask you some questions to check that you have good critical reasoning, that you have sense of self, all these things. Like, that feels more balanced in giving people options and helping them make an informed decision. But if you're only presenting someone with one side of the story where you're saying, oh, this is what you have to do, this is the only thing you should do with your life, we are the only ones with the truth, and then being like, oh, you're trapped forever. Well, that's very alarming. That is not informed consent at all.
No, I can neither fight nor flee in that situation.
Especially when you're minors, you know, your parents will freak out. You know, if you're like, no, I'm not going to do that. If you try to fight, you know, and stand up for it, that usually doesn't go that well.
Right. And you know, I know kids who did fight their parents. And so, like, and there were some parents that eventually said, okay, fine, you don't have to come to church every Sunday. But again, it varies, right? And I think for the typical Christadelphian kid, your options are, if you are like, I don't know if I like this, you don't have informed consent. It doesn't matter that you don't like it. It's freezer fun. Those are your options. So I think that can create trauma, just that whole culture around that. I do think there's a culture, like you were alluding to earlier, where people's feelings get shut down. I even think that because it's so fundamentalist, I think even people in charge, I was thinking about this when I was listening to the episode that you just recorded, thinking about people in charge and being so heady. It was the example that you gave of someone resigns and then the church says, no, we're going to do fellowship instead. And what you said was, that's so petty. But I think the people doing that are rationalizing and trying to be so heady with an H, trying to like shut down all feelings. They're like, I'm not doing this out of anger. I'm not doing this because I'm scared of what this will do to other people. I'm doing it because it's right. I'm doing it because it's the truth. I'm pretentiously pointing my finger in the air as I'm saying this for all the listeners out there.
Thank you for the live demonstration here.
and I think that I think there's so much just shutting down access to emotions in Christianity culture.
Absolutely.
So you're shutting down feelings. Someone's going to have a trauma response to that.
Yeah, I think you have to in some ways to make it work.
Yeah. Pressure to let go of like non-church activities. Sometimes
a lot of people talked about not being able to do sports and things like that they really wanted to do, that gave them, you know, that purpose and connection, everything that they wanted, and they're like, sorry, you've got to go to church.
Yeah. And then, you know, I think we've been talking about this the whole time, but just like sexism built in, patriarchy built into the culture, homophobia, transphobia.
Yep.
All of those those are just oppressive systems. So of course those are going to create trauma for people. And then, like we've said about purity culture, teenagers not being able to like think about sex.
Yeah,
it was
can't
literally
even think about it. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, it was
That's
literally
evil.
Don't think about it, and now all of a sudden you have a responsibility to your spouse, who ideally you married at 18. So you know, all of these things can be traumatic.
One of the things that came to mind when you were just talking about that was people shutting down their emotions. And one thing I thought of when going into this episode that has also come up from a number of different people is a number of people have mentioned how they had a lot of emotional maturity sort of growth after they've left, and that they didn't have that when they were there. And I say that as well personally. So if you met me when I was younger, I would like to think I'm a lot more emotionally mature than I was. Just throw that out there. And I feel like I didn't realize this was so common. I thought it was like just me, and I was like, okay, like I really gotta like work on this. And I feel like the way I viewed the world, the way I interacted with people, so much changed once I changed. And I really did change a lot after leaving. But I didn't realize that could potentially be a part of having grown up in the group. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, yeah. I think, first of all, just to say what I think we mean by emotional maturity, I think of that as being able to recognize your emotions and communicate your emotions effectively and have willingness to see the emotions in other people and be able to make space for them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I would agree with that.
And that's very hard to do when you are in a black and white environment.
And by black and white, you mean where it's always, there's only one answer here, that kind of thing, where it's very strict, there's no nuance, there's not a lot of acknowledging multiple outcomes to something. It's always, this is the right way, this is the wrong way, this is the right response, this is the wrong response.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. People are categorized. It's us versus them. It's the sheep and the goats. And even with even with the idea of forgiveness and the idea that nobody's perfect, we're going to try to be perfect, but no one's going to be. Mm-hmm. Well, the church is still enforcing discipline. Mm-hmm. The parents are still enforcing discipline. Teachers, sometimes random adults.
Yeah.
People are calling each other out, sometimes very publicly.
Yeah, and these business meetings get feisty.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the secret meetings, too, that have come up in so many episodes, and people are making these harsh judgments. And I still can't get over that there was an arranging board meeting to discuss someone who had stopped attending their sex life, explicitly talking about that in an arranging board meeting. And I was just like, this is not okay.
No.
Like, you should not be able to do that.
And I think that's, again, like, that's a lack of emotional maturity for them to say, well, we'll have a meeting on this, rather than, like, I cannot imagine that the people that were putting that meeting together were able to, like, check in with themselves and see, like, how does this make me feel to know that this person left and that this is what I know about their private life? Mm-hmm. Or this is how it's going to make them feel if they find out that we're doing this, or anything like that, right? Mm-hmm. It's just, well, this is what the Bible tells us to do. This is what the Lord says.
No empathy there. There's no groundedness of like, oh, like, this is how I would feel in that situation. It's very harsh authoritarianism.
No awareness of the hurt that's being done. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe some boundaries, too, would be another word that comes to mind here.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So is there anything else you want to add in about growing up in a high control religion, how that would impact children potentially?
I think, we've said a lot about what this does to kids, but I do think that it can really create some issues with how they relate to, like, authority figures. For one thing, maybe they are, like, just overly reliant on authority figures, or maybe they have, like, real trouble trusting authority. So, like, they might grow up and they have trouble, like, sharing anything at all with, like, their boss at work, for example.
Okay.
Something like that could happen. I do think that, and I think this is a big part of my story, the high control really made it difficult for me to know what I wanted. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I'm still dealing with, is still figuring out, like, how do I access, like, what are my dreams? What are my ambitions? Where do I want to go with my life from here? It makes it hard because you're not, in those formative years, you never learned how to tap into that part of yourself.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that for sure, that sense of self. And they even say that in, an ideal parenting situation, your parent reflects back your identity to you. So if you get a lot of, hits when you're playing baseball, they'll be like, wow, you're getting really good at baseball. And then, like, you've taken that identity of, like, I'm good at baseball, and if you have parents who don't encourage anything that makes you really unique and they're only really encouraging your conformity, you kind of become someone who doesn't have a strong sense of self, I think, just from that environment. And I remember finding that kind of topic really helpful when I was reading those books. I think it was The Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. So again, coming back to emotional maturity, but how that can impact you. And I just remember like reading my elementary school yearbook, and we were all talking about like what we're going to be when we grow up, and mine was blank because I couldn't even think of like what I wanted to be when I grew up, and like all these other kids did. And it was just like weird to see and look back and be like, yeah, like I can definitely see how that over time can really be a problem. It's not like it's all or nothing, but where there's enough of that where it's sad to be discouraged, where it's like, well, you can't be a lawyer because you're going to be a Christadelphian. You can't be a cop because you're going to be a Christadelphian. You can't be this. You can't be that. Like, I definitely heard a lot of that growing up too. And everything was kind of through the lens of being a Christadelphian. And even if you were like musically inclined, that skill would be interpreted through the lens of like, oh, well, you'll be more helpful. You can help with the choir practice at Bible schools. You can help play the piano for Sunday school. And like everything went through that lens. And so it was hard to see yourself outside of that. And I've even heard of some people who have had trouble with long-term viewing of their life, of like them living to old age, because they were sure Jesus was going to return, the kingdom was going to be set up on earth. So they didn't even make retirement accounts and didn't prepare for retirement, and ended up being like broke, and just some really serious consequences from believing the doctrine so much and not creating a life on earth that was realistic and grounded in the potential to have a long life.
Yes. You know, I talked about, I vaguely mentioned being depressed in college last time. And I honestly had trouble picturing my life past the age of 30.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily because I thought the world was going to end. I just had no idea how to do it.
Yeah.
And I think a part of me, because I was depressed, I was like, I'm probably going to be dead by then.
Yeah,
for whatever reason.
Relatable.
Yeah, but I think all those things kind of like meshed together, the depression and the
the world's going to
kingdom
end
stuff, and all of it together
makes
it really difficult for you to really come up with the life that you want.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really, it feels really sad to say that.
Oh no, we opened something up there.
It's okay. I'm all right. It's okay for that sadness to be there.
Yeah. Some people had to talk about some other experiences they had, and a really common was like a loss of identity. But also for some people, it was a loss of what they already had, because they had identified so strongly as a Christadelphian. They had, said, I have the truth, and then losing that and saying, oh, I now think that the truth was a lie, or now I don't have that identity of being a churchgoer, of being a believer, of all of those sorts of labels that they had. And one person, I remember sharing a story that they kind of overcorrected into a very aggressive atheism, because they had been kind of an aggressive Christadelphian, like, this is the truth, this is it. And then from what it sounded like, they like couldn't tolerate anyone not believing atheism. And it was like not intending to be that way, but it was like an overcorrect all the way to the other direction. So it's been interesting to hear those kinds of stories too, of other things that people may experience when they leave that. And again, tying to identity a lot too.
Yeah, I would say that I've seen versions of those types of stories with my clients, even clients who grew up in different denominations. It's tough. It can be real tough to have any idea who you are afterwards, when it was everything.
And your framework for the world, and seeing both your place in it and how to interpret it and, interact with it. Because now you have to learn to trust all of these outsiders who had been so dangerous, in the way that you were raised.
Yeah, which to go back to trauma, I mean, I think this is what makes leaving so traumatic. Even if it's kind of a smooth process, let's say nobody really gives you grief about it. Weird that I used that phrase. You're going to end up with grief, and you're going to end up with this sense of incredible loss.
Yeah.
Sometimes. And it could take a really long time to know where to go from there.
And a lot of levels of loss, pretty much across the board, people have mentioned a very quick hit of loss of community, where people that they thought they were close to have fallen away from them and have chosen not to continue to associate with them, check on them, whatever it was, but where they've definitely lost the community. But yeah, it is a lot deeper when it's a loss of your confidence in the world and your place in it. You don't have that role in it. There's just so much there. And in some ways it's, it's a beautiful fresh start, but depending on where you end up, I mean, especially for people who feel like they're more in like a midlife, I feel like that can be very jarring to be kind of back in like a starting place, as opposed to someone who leaves like 18 where they're already kind of starting out in life in a way already. It can still be upsetting when you were raised in that, but I think it seems like for a lot of people who left when they were older, there's a whole extra layer there too of giving up something that you'd worked hard on for so many years, that you'd put, a lot of effort into and time, almost like the sunk cost fallacy, where it's like, I already put so much into it and I'm not getting anything out of that investment I had put in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people with kids who are still in the church, I mean, my God, I can't, so grateful that that wasn't my situation, but it's hard. It's an incredible sense of loss for so many of us.
Yeah. And then another thing that came up just in conversation with ex-Christadelphians was the Christadelphian culture around mental health. So some people have heard people say, like Christadelphians say, like, why would anyone have a mental health issue? Like, why would you be depressed? You have the truth, or you have the hope, and kind of saying that mental health issues shouldn't exist when you're a Christadelphian, because we should be so happy that we have found the truth, which is quite a line, quite a bold line. Is that the magic pill for depression from a therapist? Is that what you would say?
No. We have a term for that, actually.
Ooh.
It's called spiritual bypassing.
Nice.
And it can also refer to just anyone being upset. This is honestly, this is what a lot of like the shutting down feelings that we've been talking about, or standing up and someone saying, no. You just need to read more. You just need to pray more. It's...
Do you like my facial expressions there?
I like your facial expression. I will leave that to the imagination of the audience.
Yeah.
All of that is spiritual bypassing, because what it is saying is spirituality is essentially a replacement for mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, it's just not true. I don't know what else to say about it necessarily.
You're like, it's so ridiculous. Don't make me respond. But it makes me think of like how they talk about the kingdom, where it's like, we're just going to like praise God forever and we'll never need to sleep or eat again because we're going to be like the angels. And like, that sounds terrible. But like, technically you wouldn't be like depressed because you're basically now a worshiping robot. Like, I don't know. But that's what it makes me think of, is like, you should only ever think about God and being happy. So don't be depressed. It just feels like turning off your humanity. It's like, just stop being a person. Stop having feelings. Stop being so complex. We don't want to acknowledge anything like that. And we don't want to do anything about it. Because, I mean, imagine you were one of those people who was in a situation where, you were sexually harassed by someone in your CYC, and now you have to keep seeing that person and seeing them as a trigger. You're having fight or flight. You're feeling depressed. Maybe things are escalating and they're trying to, do something and push your boundaries, and it's not good. And you try to say something to someone like, hey, I'm having anxiety. Hey, I don't feel good. I'm feeling depressed every time CYC rolls around. And people are like, but you've got the kingdom and the hope of Jesus. And like, that doesn't address anything. You're not doing anything to help this person. You're not taking action. You're not providing an outlet for them to talk to someone who will care and potentially take action to help this person and provide a resource for them to figure something out to make the situation better. And I feel like the whole thing with mental health is, it's valid. And it stinks to have. So ideally you want to do something about it to make it better. If someone says they have mental health issues, ideally be like, okay, like, if I can't help you, if I'm not trained, like, maybe you should talk to someone. Like, find a way to address it so that you can have better quality of life. It really sucks to have. And so it's so sad to see that just so blatantly dismissed, and to hear about that happening to people in Christadelphia, I definitely know mine wasn't really taken seriously, but I feel like also in just my family unit, it wasn't really like a thing. No one else was really dealing with it till my generation. But, it's like it was there, and it's so sad to see the difference it makes to when you take steps to improve mental health, just how much better your life can be, and then knowing that in religious cultures that they could just put a Band-Aid on it and be like, think about God more, read your Bible more, you'll be fine. Like, nope, that's not really a solution there. Just pretending it doesn't exist and that you should be more religious as a solution.
Yeah, I'll just say, here's the thing that I would want to do if someone was saying that, even if we're giving them the biggest benefit of the doubt, yes, and not assuming that they're saying that out of any kind of like bad intentions. They're not trying to cover anything up or anything.
Yeah, like you said, they might be just those people that are in their heads and just can't. They're trying, this is what the Bible says I need to do.
Maybe, or they're just uncomfortable with your mental health issues. I kind of just want to give it back to them and say, why is it so much of a problem if I do have a mental health condition that needs treatment? Mm-hmm. Why is it a problem if I have unpleasant emotions and I'm not happy all the time?
Oh, God. I only realized when I was getting older that I had a huge trauma around being angry. It just wasn't allowed. And it made me send me into a panic because I was like, everyone's going to leave me. It just wasn't allowed. You're just not allowed. You're bad if you're angry ever. And that is so disabling. And so just, it's terrible to hear about any emotion being shut down. It's just like, oh, that's not allowed. That's bad. Like, no, it's an emotion. It's a way of informing your body so you can make decisions. But especially with anger, it tends to come with something else. So like maybe you're angry because you're actually sad you got left out. Maybe you're angry because you're in a rush and you're stressed about your performance at work, whatever it is. And so usually there's something else where anger tends to be a motivating thing. And so if you're able to harness it and recognize why you're feeling that could prompt change. If you're angry at your spouse because they're always working late, it's like, okay, well, I'm angry because I'm not getting enough time and my needs aren't being met. Let me talk to them about that. Not me just yell at them because I'm upset, but look at why I'm angry. And so I think that really defangs people with their fight response by taking away their ability to be angry, because that's when you can say, hey, something in this community isn't right and it should change. And I think often that's what communities need. And I think if you want the Christadelphian community to be more sustainable and healthier for people, then you would probably want to allow people to be able to be angry enough to say this needs to change. Women need to be able to be treated equally and things like that. But just telling people certain emotions aren't allowed is not going to be a really productive way forward, I wouldn't say. Whatever
Absolutely
emotion
not.
it may be.
No, I have a particular therapeutic modality that I use, but I pretty much across pretty much all the therapeutic modalities out there, they're going to say your feelings are important. Lean into them and learn from them.
Yeah. Especially like we said with intuition earlier too, it can be protective. It definitely can make a big difference in the choices you make. And like with your self-preservation, you're like, oh, I don't feel safe around this person. Please lean into it, kids. Get out. And I do want to hear more about what modalities you use. And you had mentioned the parts work. So would you mind telling us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the approach that I use, the formal name is Internal Family Systems, and I'm level 1 trained in it. And it's called parts work informally. There's some other modalities that can also be considered parts work. I think it's really helpful for religious trauma because of essentially what it says, and it's honestly flying right in the face of this idea of, well, you should only ever be happy. Well, maybe I am happy. Maybe a part of me is happy. Mm-hmm. But this part of me is angry about something, or this part of me is depressed. Mm-hmm. This part of me feels unsafe. There's another part of me that's saying, no, I have plenty of reasons to feel safe. But this part over here is, it's in my body, it's in my nervous system, and it's saying something. So what's nice about parts work is it really creates a framework for making space for these different parts of you to exist simultaneously, rather than thinking of us as being like mono-minded. right? The black and white nature of fundamentalist religion is like, well, you believe this one thing and that is it.
And if you're not grateful, then you must be ungrateful, where it's like, I can be grateful, but also angry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can have multiple things going on at once. It doesn't have to be where one invalidates another.
Yeah, not even, this is a slight nitpick, not even grateful but angry. Grateful and angry.
Yeah. I'm okay with that. I would agree with that. Yeah, you can be multiple things at once.
Yeah, exactly right. Grateful and angry, side note, would be a great name for a band.
Yeah.
Actually, I feel like Grateful and Angry, that does sound like a Christadelphian metal band. Maybe they're the ones that perform Harbingers of Destruction.
If someone ever wants to cover and make a song for Harbingers of Destruction, please do and send me the audio. I will play it. That'd be fantastic.
That will become the new theme song.
I had so much fun asking my friend to do that clip for me. I love it. I went back and listened to it over and over again.
So back on topic. So the idea of parts, just even in and of itself, even just practicing thinking about parts and recognizing them as parts of you, being able to say, I notice a part of me that is angry, rather than just simply saying, I'm angry, can feel like a world of difference sometimes.
I think it brings back the grayscale, too, when you're used to thinking black and white.
Exactly right. It brings back the grayscale. So even just simply operating in that mode of parts work can in itself be healing after many years of the black and white religious thinking. But on top of that, IFS is a trauma modality, because a lot of times our parts, we may originally identify our parts as like, this is the part that feels angry, or maybe this is the part that believes I should be a perfectionist, or this is the part that is glad that I'm gone from the community, and then this is the part that's sad that I'm gone from the community. Like, even that in itself can help you navigate the complexities of loss, like we said.
Yeah.
But on top of that, as we another thing that we do with parts work is we start to get to know these parts, and we come back to that sense of intuition that religion, that Christadelphia often takes away from us, and we start to dialogue with these parts. So when we said earlier, really slowing down and sitting with the part of you that wants to drink, for example, if you can find that part of you in your body and identify it and start a dialogue with it and ask it, how long have you been around? What is it that you're actually trying to do? Finding out how all of these different parts are trying to help you. Because I believe every single part of your psychology is trying to help you. Even those that seem the most self-destructive. They're trying to get you away from some kind of pain.
Your body's whole goal is to keep your body alive, basically.
Right. We're all still mammals at the end of the day. No matter how rationalizing we are about our behavior, we're all still mammals.
Yeah.
And again, not endorsing self-destructive behaviors, but being able
Please
to
don't,
see...
people. It's not good.
Yeah. But being able to see how that part of you might actually be trying to cope with something, seeing how it's trying to help you, you can start to change your relationship and maybe even start to figure out, well, maybe there's a different way. If I've got a positive relationship with this part of me, maybe there's some way that I can help it out. And maybe it has trouble seeing what's going to help. So that's one way to kind of describe what parts work is like.
Okay.
It's helpful for trauma as well, because a lot of these parts we find out are different ages. I mentioned the question of asking how long a part has been around. So we get a lot of inner child work going on.
Oh, yeah, I did a little bit of that.
I do that every time I talk to my therapist, because I'm doing IFS too. I'm talking to my inner kids all the time. And there are different ones. There's a 3-year-old, there's a 7-year-old, there's a teenager. They're all holding on to different things. And so sometimes you might even find that a part is, we originally got in touch with this depressed part, and we thought, this is the part of me that feels depressed. Well, being depressed isn't what actually defines that part. What defines that part is it remembers what it was like when you were 13, let's say, and this is a part that actually really values this thing that you valued when you were that age. or it values something that you really needed. Maybe when you were 13, you moved away to a different town and you lost all your friends. And so this part of you developed as a way of pointing out how important it is to hold on to your friends. And as you've grown up, you've continued the cycle of meeting friends and then losing friends just as naturally as people do. And so that part feels like a depressed part. It feels like it's been depressed for a long time, but what that part actually wants is not to be depressed. It wants you to be happy. It itself wants to feel happy. But it's depressed because it doesn't know how to get you that long-term feeling of friendship that it's wanted for you.
Yeah.
Right. That's an example I'm pulling out of thin air. But that's what we can do. And so these parts, especially for those of us with trauma, these parts are really loaded into our nervous system. These are the things that actually remember those threat responses, those trauma responses that we were talking about earlier. And so sometimes we bring that part up and we say, oh, this is the part of me. I've been able to get through the part of me that's engaging in the self-destructive behavior. And it's okay with letting me get in touch with the part of me that just simply hurts, the part that it's been exiling this whole time. I can get in touch with that pain. I feel the powerlessness. I feel the trauma response of wanting to fight or flee, but I'm in touch with that. It fills my body and it's been exiled for so long because it's really intense. And now I'm here with it in the present moment and I can share my adult self with it and say, hey, you're safe now. You're in my body. Let's experience this safe adulthood together.
Yeah, I think like rewriting the story almost and accepting the past while moving into the future is just such a healthy place to be.
Yeah. And so this method really helps people to engage in trauma recovery on the level of their nervous system. It's not just heady. It's not just, well, I believe that I'm in danger. Now I'm going to tell myself that I believe.
Oh no,
I'm
I
safe.
remember there's a lot of crying for me.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
like you feel things, you know, you process. I did so much journaling and stuff too, like really sitting with it, you know, thinking about it, feeling it, bring up everything that it brought up and,
Yes.
you know, accepting it and also like challenging it almost sometimes too. You know, like, hey, that's what happened, but that's not what should have happened. Like, I've also heard of the inner child work where you kind of rewrite the story like, okay, this is what they did. This is what I could have used at that time. And if I was there now, this is what I would have done to have handled it. This is what I deserved. So that too, that form of inner child work, something that I looked into and found helpful in books. And I will say, I remember the first time I heard about it, I thought it was really weird and I didn't plan on doing it, but I did warm up to it. I do think it was helpful. So it's cool to hear that it's something that's worked well with your clients who are also dealing with trauma.
Yeah, it's great. The other thing I'll say too is, especially for those of us with religious trauma, I don't know about you, but in adulthood, I have felt a strong disconnect from that younger Christian part of me, or parts. There's more than one young Christian part of me. And part of my journey has been realizing, well, those are still parts of me now. They're still in there. I remember that. And not that any of these parts still believe in Christadelphian doctrine or anything like that, but they still feel the things that they felt. They still behave the way that they behaved. And working through the shame that I developed as an adult once I was like, well, I'm not a Christian anymore. And now suddenly I'm extremely ashamed of who I was when I was a Christadelphian.
That's certainly something else that can come up too. Yeah.
Yeah. Parts work can help with integrating all these parts together, developing positive relationships with them. And it does not mean I'm going back into Christianity. It doesn't mean I'm changing my beliefs again. What it means is that you're accepting all the parts of yourself and becoming more whole and feeling less of that internal conflict.
One of the things that just reminded me of when you started talking about feeling shame was that sometimes for people, they may be one of those people who was enforcing the rules of the group. And when they leave, they can also often have a certain level of trauma from knowing that they inflicted trauma on others. I remember one of the few places where I've really seen that kind of brought up was one documentary for the Twin Flames cult, and it was on Netflix. and, initially learn about how people get into it. None of them were born into it. Obviously, it was a newer thing, internet age kind of group. Talks about, what happened while they were members, and they interview a number of people who have left. And I still remember very distinctly one of the women who talked about how she kind of ended up in these high-level roles, and it damaged her relationship with her sister, and she had to do all these things that hurt other people, life-altering things for them, and then leaving and having so much shame for the actions she took while she was a member of the group, and really not knowing how to handle that and what to do with that. So that's another thing that can even come up. And I just kind of wanted to throw that out there because I don't think there's a lot of resources for people who are more specifically in those positions, but certainly for some people who've been in a higher level position or who have maybe left after a really long time in the group. And it's often very eye-opening to leave and finally be able to look back at your experiences with a clearer vision, more maturity, as we've discussed, some of those kinds of things, and to feel some pretty big emotions around that potentially, depending on what your role was like and what you were doing and what your micro group, your ecclesia specifically, potentially, or your family or whatever within the group was like. Because that can be challenging too, I imagine, to sit with and try to build a life moving past all of that. Because that's a whole nother level of trauma too around religion, and in that case a cultic group that wasn't necessarily religion but behaving as a cult.
Yeah, I mean, even for me, not that I necessarily was high up, but I talked last time about just having privilege, being part of one of the big families, being a straight cis young man. I've had shame about how I treated other people my age, for example. I could be really judgy towards some other kids sometimes, and even just, I mean, geez, like how long did it take me for me to realize, homophobia is bad? Longer than I wish. I wish that.
Yeah.
I'd never.
Unfortunately, you're taught the harsher view first.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then you have to challenge that on your own and figure out that's like, oh wait, they didn't do anything wrong. They're not bad. I've met so many wonderful people.
Right. Right. And so, there is shame about that. And so, I do think that IFS is a very helpful modality for that sort of issue. Being able to befriend these parts of us that did things that were not great.
Yeah, that certainly sounds like it.
And helping to cultivate an understanding. Sometimes these parts don't even realize why they did these things, and helping them to realize, why did you think that was good? Well, ultimately, I did those things because I thought it was the right thing to do, because it was important for me to stay in the group, because I was terrified of getting kicked out. Getting down to these real base motivators for these previous behaviors and figuring out it's all part of trying to survive.
Yeah, and forgiving yourself for what you did when you were trying to survive.
And maybe forgiving other people, but I'm not going to push that on anyone. That does not have to be part of trauma recovery.
Yeah, I've seen a few things over the years that are kind of aggressive for you need to forgive people. And I'm like, I don't think so, actually.
No, this is really important. This is really important in trauma work to say forgiveness is an optional goal.
Yeah.
You do not ever have to get there.
Yeah, because they'll be like, well, there's people who forgave their murders of their children. I'm like, all right, if that works for them, fine. But I don't want to ever see that guy again. I don't want to ever think about him again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like trying to make people who are traumatized into saints is what it feels like. I was like, I don't think this is the time to try to push your narrative on people. They're going through something. They shouldn't have an expectation on them as well. Are there any patterns or interesting things that you've noticed from working with clients over the years that you thought might be relevant to share?
One thing that I've noticed with some folks is they might have, if I'm using parts language, they might have fundamentalist parts that stick around even after they leave religion.
Yeah.
Right. I do have people who stay really rigid about their new beliefs. Like you said, aggressive atheism earlier. They may have a lot of trouble trusting anything that they cannot completely prove. And I think what's going on there is there's still, this part of them that is holding on to that. It can feel very rational. It can feel very logical
Very
and unemotional.
I'm
Well,
sure.
and very safe. Yes. And I think that there's still fear underneath all of it.
That's what I would think too.
And it's still weirdly something that they learned from fundamentalism. Their church told them, if you are going to leave, you need to have a bulletproof justification for leaving. And so by the time I talk to these folks, they're like, yeah, I came up with a bulletproof justification. And so then I'm like, okay, how do you feel? And they're like, I don't know. And it's feelings are really hard. It's hard to like dive in when being heady has been so protective for them. And again, the headiness, it helped them get out. It's a very important part of their system. So I'm not saying that to disrespect that at all. But it can be hard for them to go from that into rebuilding intuition. They
To
really
get
have
out
trouble.
of their head and into their body again. Yeah.
Right. And so that can make it difficult to notice the nervous system, to notice what they're feeling, which is a rephrasing of what we were saying earlier, where you need to get that sense of safety first. And they just might not have that yet.
Yeah. I remember I kept hearing in a lot of things that I read that dancing was a good way to get into your body. So I remember that was one of the reasons I actually started taking dance classes years ago, was as part of like trauma recovery, to just try it out. I do feel like that helped a little bit.
Yeah, a lot of people in religious trauma recovery and in IFS, my IFS training was over Zoom, and we would have these awkward like Zoom dance breaks. Like when we'd come back from lunch. Oh, it was so awkward. It was not my favorite part of training.
It makes me cringe a little bit.
But that's just my own parts coming up. That's your parts coming up. And I don't want people to see me dancing because it's vulnerable, but that's the whole point. It's vulnerable.
Yeah.
Right? I would always turn off my camera. But yeah, dance, doing things to get into your body, doing any kind of activity that helps you just be more present. Can be helpful, like you were saying.
Get out of your head. Yeah, some things are great, like even like gardening, I found can be meditative in that kind of way too, where you're moving and out of your head.
Another pattern I can speak to is most of my clients, they say like, I'm fully out of religion. I'm not religious anymore. I'm not going to church. But a lot of what we are working on is, they haven't fully shared themselves like with their family. They don't know how to be authentic anymore. Maybe they've told their parents like, I'm not religious, but their parents haven't seemed to understand. And so maybe they're not talking about it, or like they're just not sure how to move forward with those relationships. I think a lot of people, like they find a certain level of freedom by finally saying, I'm free of these beliefs. I'm not going to church anymore. Maybe I even live in a different state or a different part of the country, or the world even perhaps, but they still feel trapped in some ways.
That is interesting. Well, yeah, it's like they're trapped because they haven't set themselves free by like reclaiming who they are, it sounds like, and just saying like, yeah, this is who I am.
Yeah. Reclaiming is a really good word. Thank you for bringing that up.
No problem.
Because I do think reclamation that can be a really helpful step in recovery. I talked last time about how like I went back to Cleveland last summer for a few weeks, and like I reclaimed the city for myself.
Yeah.
And by that I mean I was like, I don't have to be scared of this city. I don't have to be angry with it or hate it. A lot of other people don't like Cleveland, but I went in the
for
summer.
other reasons. Yeah.
It was beautiful, and we drove around, looked at a lot of houses and stuff, and it was like, it's great. The lake was looking beautiful.
Nice.
So you can reclaim things. You can reclaim pieces of your identity, and reclamation can refer to claiming things for the first time. So sometimes it feels like what you're doing is you're reclaiming your sexuality. You were never allowed to have it before. You're reclaiming your confidence, your assertiveness. You're reclaiming authenticity.
Oh, I
so
love
that's
these.
another big part of, if you're doing parts work, that's what these parts need. These parts are looking for those things. They value those things. And so as an adult, if you're in a safer environment, you might be able to help these parts of you find those things again or for the first time.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, I love that.
Oh, you brought it up, so thank you for mentioning that word.
Oh, you're welcome. Would you have any tips for people around finding a religious trauma therapist or working with a therapist around religion, some things like that?
Yeah, so one thing you can do is starting possibly with directories that have religious trauma therapists. You might be able to, there may be online directories that just have religious trauma as like a drop-down choice. Most of them don't, which
you said it's so new too.
It is a real tragedy that the closest you might get is spirituality, which means good luck. You're going to be navigating through a bunch of Christian counselors who are going to pray with you during therapy. I'm kidding.
Yeah,
they shouldn't pray with you if you don't want them to.
But that would still be rough. Yeah, I don't see that being that helpful for people.
It's not going to be helpful for people to search for spirituality most of the time.
Okay, good to know.
There are a couple directories that I like to point people to. We just talked about reclamation. And so I think, I don't know if this website has a directory beyond the United States.
Yeah, that would be your local expertise. If anyone knows resources from other countries, they can let me know and I can add them to the notes because you're from the US. So that's going to be your local expertise and your knowledge.
Good point. Yeah, so I can at least talk about this website called the Reclamation Collective.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So they have a therapist directory. I'm on that directory. And just on like the results page, you search for a location. It can be like a whole state. I think you can even use the map view. And in the results, it'll say what types of faiths do they have experience working with.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So it can be Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Evangelical, Judaism.
I'm sure Christadelphian does not pop up on there.
It doesn't show up.
We're gonna have to fill that in. Be like, excuse me.
I do have fundamentalist. That's I think the closest I've gotten to.
All right, so that might be what people want to look for potentially if they were using that website. Okay.
Honestly, even saying that, and I've had several ex-Jehovah's Witness clients, and that's like the one like denomination where I've been like, as a denomination, this is the closest thing to what I experienced growing up.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah. Okay. So, I don't have Catholicism listed. Right. But so you can use that website to find religious trauma therapists. Some of them are still religious. Some of them are spiritual, but are not part of any sort of affiliated religion. Okay. So that would be something to check. They may have that on their profile. It may be something that if you like someone's profile and you want to get in touch, if you ask them, most therapists in private practice offer free screening calls. I do like a consultation. Yeah. Feel free to ask. With religious trauma in particular, this is one of those places where, this is one of those areas where therapists should be forthcoming and saying, this is where I'm at religiously. Or spiritually.
For transparency, yeah.
Yeah, because we need that as clients.
Yeah, that's going to shape my impression of you and what you're speaking to me about. If you're like, because especially if, I feel like I would rather someone that has no religion, just because then I know they have no agenda. Like I know where they're coming from is that they don't believe in something. So they're not going to try to sell me a new religion.
I can't tell you how many. Actually, I might be able to. I might be able to count on one hand, but it feels like a lot. It's far too many. One is far too many.
Oh, no.
I've had clients or even potential clients reach out to me and tell me I was working with a therapist before, and then I realized like their own religious bias was getting in the way.
Yeah. Well, and even if it's unintentional.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, it should always be unintentional because for God's sakes, it's unethical.
Let's pray about it. Let's pray about your trauma.
I had someone tell me that they had a therapist invite them to their church.
Oh.
When they were seeing them about religious trauma. The therapist's response was essentially, according to this client, you're going to the wrong church.
That's wild. No.
I've had clients, and this can happen outside of the context of working on religious trauma as well. And it is a big problem. And hopefully it's getting better over time. But I've had queer clients, queer and trans non-binary clients talk to therapists that claimed like, yes, I'm a queer ally, and then start doubting their sexual identity. And they're like, are you sure that that's your experience?
Whoa. That's also so messed up. It's so invalidating. And we were just talking about reclamation and figuring things out for yourself and taking hold of your identity. And then just like, how about you don't do that?
Right.
Oh.
And it's re-traumatizing, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely.
I will also say that the Reclamation Collective, they have a directory. They also offer trainings for therapists. They also offer support groups and so on.
Nice.
And so even though, there are providers on the directory who may still be spiritual and religious, anything like that would be re-traumatizing, that is not something the Reclamation Collective endorses. Their trainings for therapists are very much like, you have to take this seriously. You are creating a very important space for people. So I really like them as an organization.
Awesome.
I took a support group with them a little while back. It was a support group for therapists working on deconstruction. It was a really fruitful time. And so that's something that even for people outside the United States, I believe they can join these support groups. That might be another helpful thing to check out.
If the time zones work out.
Well, yeah. That's true. It might be morning where you are, even though it's an evening group, according to the host. So Reclamation Collective might be a nice place. Asking these types of questions is a good idea. If you want to make it a little bit easier in terms of what their spiritual background is, there's another directory called the Secular Therapy Project. And all of the therapists on there, they say, I am not religious, I'm not spiritual, and I use evidence-based therapeutic approaches. So that might also be a nice way to feel safe with the person that you are establishing a therapeutic relationship.
Yeah, that's definitely valuable to pick the right therapist who you're comfortable with, who accepts you and is going to be safe and supportive for you to be in, to be vulnerable, for sure.
Yeah. So those might be a couple nice places to start. And, there are so many different ways. I mean, sometimes people are just like going through their insurance and just like going through like, I want to meet someone in person. So who does my insurance cover that's in driving distance? And if that's the approach you've got to take, that's the approach you've got to take. Some other things that you might want to ask in that consultation call or early on, if you can, ask them about, are they trauma informed or are they trauma trained? So there's a difference there. Trauma informed is going to be someone who is trained enough to understand triggers, and they are going to have awareness of like, oh, I need to be careful as we approach this thing. Maybe I'll be careful with the type of language that I use or the imagery that I evoke because I don't want to create a trauma response while we're working together. Whereas trauma trained would be, I'm trained in a trauma modality. I use IFS or I use EMDR or lifespan integration, which are not modalities we talked about. But ask them like, what do you actually do for trauma, for treating trauma? Or are you just creating a space and you're going to try not to trigger it? And ask them to explain it. You can ask them what their specific training is. You can ask them like, how does the work that you do, where does the nervous system come in the type of work that you do? Ask them about like, how do they handle trust issues? What comes up when people in the past have struggled to like, maybe something, this has happened to me. I've said something that I thought was completely benign, but somehow like they heard it a certain way and it created trust issue. How does this therapist handle situations like that? Feel free to ask them those types of things. These are questions. They might make the consultation call last a little while. That's okay. These are things that, especially working with religious trauma, they should be willing to answer up front. And then the other things to look out for, this might be something that you have to get into like your full appointments. Might take a couple weeks to like feel it out, but like, what's the general vibe? We're talking about developing intuition and checking in with like your nervous system. You know, what's your body telling you as best as you can tell when you're talking to this person.
Yeah, I had someone who I felt like was in a rush to get rid of me the one time, and I've had ones where just the vibe was off. I was like, I don't feel it with you.
Yeah. I had someone like that too.
Mm-hmm.
We met once, and then I was like, I don't think this is the right person for me. That's okay. This is what informed consent is all about, being able to make choices and work with the person that's right for you. One other thing to look out for is, are they asking you to just like trauma dump? Do they want you to narrate everything from the start? There are do they seem like overly fascinated with what you're saying? I've had people talk about this.
Huh.
I've had people tell me it just felt like they were just like, they just wanted to hear everything, and then they were just like kind of horrified at the end of the story. And like, it's like, great, I get that you're horrified. You're the therapist. Help me. This is my time.
Yeah.
Like, is it more for you or is it more for them? I will make a space here to say that there are some therapists that use narrative therapy. That is an approach.
Okay.
It's not considered a trauma recovery approach, but it is a therapeutic approach. And so if they use narrative therapy, just like ask them about like, how does that work for trauma? Like what's their philosophy behind it? See if that sounds right or not.
Yeah. And what's our plan here? What should
Exactly
I feel
right.
in a few weeks kind of thing, potentially too? Like, is this going to help me?
And what are we going to do if it's actually really triggering? How are we going to handle it?
Yeah.
If it's really hard for me to share all this, or if I just don't want to, if my system just does not consent to that, if I don't give permission to tell you all this stuff.
If you're not ready.
Yeah. What do we do then? I would not generally say narrative therapy is the way to go if you want to specifically tackle
work around trauma.
Because it's not a trauma recovery.
Yeah, I don't see that being helpful.
I do like narrative therapy in some contexts.
Yeah, and I feel like I've shared with people, I feel like talking on the podcast can be healing for me. I feel like reporting things to the police was healing for me, where it feels like I'm taking action, I'm reclaiming my story, and I feel like I'm able to leave more of it in the past, and kind of overcome any triggers that may be lingering for me that can be helpful. But I feel like it has to be very intentional. And again, I feel like it's also action oriented, where I'm trying to share my story to help other people on the podcast, going to the police, potentially put things on the record that could help other people, like if that person assaults someone else, it's now there that they've assaulted someone before. So the consequences ideally should be more serious, things like that. So that too, it wasn't just, I'm going to talk about it, to this random stranger who's going to be like, whoa, that was crazy.
Exactly right. Exactly. Yeah. So I think just being like really intentional with what it is that you're going to be doing with this therapist. Yeah. Really trying to be clear. One thing I like about IFS is that because there's a somatic element to it, I'll tell people, and they'll be like, I've talked to like X number of therapists already. I want to keep working on this, but my God, am I tired of sharing my story over and over? And I'll say, you don't have to tell me your story. At least not all at once, at least not up front. Yeah. You can come in that first session, let's just start with how are you feeling? And just go from there. And so sometimes there are some folks where like a lot of the story I still haven't heard, and that's fine. Yeah. Because we're still working with the parts that are with them now.
So. That's cool to hear. Yeah, I'm sure that's a relief for a lot of people. And when you started talking about somatic, it made me think about in the body. And I definitely remember doing like some tapping stuff, like the EFT kind of thing. And even that I thought was a little bit helpful for feeling things like move through your body and letting go of certain feelings too.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that I'll say also, since we're, I think, still answering the question of how to find a therapist, since I'm plugging IFS, I'll also say that the IFS Institute has a directory, and so that is worldwide.
Okay, so you could find worldwide trauma-trained therapists?
Yes. And again, this is further away from, not everybody there specializes in religious trauma.
Yeah, but they would have an idea of the parts work at least, which could be helpful.
Right.
Some trauma skills.
Right. It may be better. Honestly, the IFS therapist that I have, I did not ask up front, hey, what are your religious beliefs? We kind of backed into that conversation later on, and it's been great. But there could also be something to be said, and I think everyone just has to answer this question for themselves. Is it more important to have a secular therapist who maybe doesn't know as much trauma training, or is it okay to have a therapist who may be Christian and hopefully, but they're ethical and they don't put their values on you and they're trauma trained? I could see both sides depending on what a person needs.
Yeah, and depends what's available to them in their area, in their time zone, in their budget, in their insurance coverage, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But that's good to have that framework. So both resources for potentially finding someone who has good training that might be a good fit for this kind of situation where if you have religious trauma you want to work on, but also tips for if you don't have that toolkit or someone doesn't have formal religious trauma training. And as you said, it's still fairly recent. So we'll probably see through our lifetime some change in conversation, training, availability of therapists with this kind of background as well. But to be able to work with potentially another therapist to make it work to still work on religious trauma without that being their area of expertise formally. Yeah, that sounds great. And then we'll share some resources in the show notes. So I'll share a bunch of the ones you mentioned. I also today had looked at some of the YouTube videos for the person that Couture had recommended, and there was one called How to Start Deconstructing Your Christian Faith and a few other interesting ones, so I thought I'd link those as well. So I'll add a few things too for people who want to look more into this stuff about religious trauma, deconstruction, as well as some of the harmful things that potentially contribute to religious trauma in a group like the Christadelphians or another group if you're coming to us from a different group with that background. Anything else you wanted to share today?
Yeah, I realized one of the resources would have been really helpful in the how do I know if I'm experiencing religious trauma conversation.
Which one?
The Reclamation Collective has created a resource called the Spiritual Power Inventory Tool.
What? You got it.
The Spiritual Power Inventory is a series of questions that you can ask as a person who is not the person in power. So you can use this even in your relationship with your therapist.
Okay.
And so the questions are, who do you trust? Do you have a way out? Is there a system of accountability in place to report hypothetical abuse of trust or power in the relationship? And by that, we mean an actual system of accountability, not just something on paper, but something that actually works.
Something where things actually happen when you report it.
Right. Do you have the opportunity or sense of safety to set boundaries with this person? And has this person communicated where their supportive role begins and ends?
Yeah, just thinking about my experience in Christadelphians, like, wow. Things I never even thought about either. I wasn't like, yeah, of course you need a way out. I was like, no, that you just grow up knowing there's no way out. Yeah.
But the nice thing about this is that it also has something for spiritual and faith leaders. And honestly, it's even something that therapists can do. These are helpful questions for me to assess.
Okay.
So, have you taken inventory of the power dynamics represented in your supportive relationships or the communities or individual relationships with whom you hold power and influence? Do those you support have a way out? Is there a system of accountability for that person to report the hypothetical abuse? What kind of boundaries are in place to respect the autonomy and safety of the individuals who you hold spiritual power with? Oof. Where does your supportive role begin and end? And reflecting back, have there been times where you may have misused your spiritual power or exploited a power dynamic with a parishioner, a congregant, or other person you've held supportive space for?
Wow.
So this can be helpful for people running churches. I know we didn't really talk about that a whole lot.
Yeah, I could see that being a good thing for them to read, potentially if there are people with the humility and desire to make a safe, supportive environment for their members. That all seems like great places to start and to see what your weaknesses are to make it a safer environment. Again, if you really want to shift Christadelphians from being high control into a really safe community that people want to be in and don't feel forced to be in and aren't pressured into, then that would be like a really great resource for them, I think.
Yeah. So I just wanted to make sure that I was going to give it to you in the list of resources, but I wanted to make sure I actually said it out loud, read these questions out loud, because there aren't too many.
Yeah, so people know it's there. Yeah, we do have a few people who regularly listen who are still Christadelphians too. So it's always nice to point something that way of hey, here's a nice resource potentially for you if you wanted to take that into the Christadelphian space. I know one thing that we had added to the list to talk about was, what could we do to make Christadelphian ecclesias less traumatizing? And I feel like that's one of them, is just have more open conversations about things that are not working well for people that don't have the power in the ecclesias. Look at your power dynamics, accept that it's there, and invite the other people to meet you with it and find ways to make it so that that is not abused.
Yeah, I guess the one other thing that I'll add, and maybe even the spiritual power inventory is a good example of it, is having third-party accountability and getting trainings from third parties.
Yeah, I think the third party part is important, and I said that whenever the Ecclesia Stay program stuff kind of came up, is just, I don't think it should all be in-house. I think when you have power and it's your own reputation on the line that you're enforcing, you're encouraging a culture of covering things up potentially, and having people that aren't going to do the right thing when there's a very strong interest in protecting your image.
Yeah, you need someone else who doesn't have a conflict of interest. That's incredibly important.
Yeah, I think that's typically where governments come in. But again, churches tend to be kind of this outlier in a lot of ways, with whether it's taxation or having enforcement of certain things. The government doesn't get too involved until it gets to the point of illegal stuff going on. So,
and even then, they might not. Yeah.
Very cynical of churches.
Me too.
Well, I think this was a great overview today. Hopefully people enjoy it. I know we got a lot into nitty gritty of definitions and stuff at the beginning, but I think that gave us a good foundation so we could talk about all kinds of different things today. And as I said, I'd opened it up to other ex-Christadelphians to see if anyone had something they want us to bring up. And mostly people are just sharing their experiences. So I did just want to highlight examples of how religious trauma has showed up in people who left the Christadelphian community. And again, to encourage people to be more educated about resources, to have a little bit of, a recommendation from a professional on navigating finding a religious trauma therapist if they think that would be helpful for them, and just open up this conversation a little bit more. If there's ever other religious therapists who have other modalities that they want to talk about and come on, always more than happy to have multiple perspectives and to hear more about this, and especially with it being an evolving specialty and expertise. I'm sure there'll be more things that we could talk about, and even today there was many things I'm sure we could have dived into a lot deeper. So please let me know how you guys like this episode, and if we want to talk more about religious trauma in the future. I certainly enjoyed it. I thought it was educational and upbeat for the most part, focusing on moving forward, which is nice when so much of this is oral histories really, and going to the past for people who were in the community. So it's a nice change from our usual. So thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I had a great time as well. And whether there are more conversations coming up, in the Facebook group, or you want to just ask me about stuff offline or anything, I'm happy to be a resource. And I know it was an incomplete and probably imperfect conversation just because there's so much to talk about, but I hope this is helpful for people.
Yeah, it's always off the cuff, so I don't expect perfection on the podcast. We're doing the best we can in the moment. But I appreciate everyone who has tuned in to listen, and thank you again for listening to another episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for some various resources that were mentioned in the podcast episode, and some that may not have been, but that we decided to throw down there in case you're curious about them. So that's all for today, and thanks again for listening to the Life After Leaving podcast. We'll see you next time. Bye. Thank you to everyone who has helped make this episode of the podcast possible. Today's episode was edited by me, Zinnia. I'd also like to thank Al Kroons for creating our intro music, and the ex-Christadelphians that submitted audio for the intro music. If you'd like to join our community, you can find us at the group for ex-Christadelphians on Facebook. You can also follow our social media on Facebook and Instagram at LifeAfterLeavingPodcast. If you'd like to come on the podcast, reach out to me at lifeafterleavingpodcast@gmail.com. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a rating and review or sharing this podcast with a friend. That's all for today. Thanks and see you next time.